Good afternoon, Quasar Markets Live. I have a really good one today. A dear friend of mine, Dr. Patrick Bell. I've known him so long that he was with me in my White House days. You were my roommate, Patrick. How are you, man?
I'm great. Yeah, I can't remember those days on Capitol Hill. It's crazy that we're here again.
Yes, of course. And one of the things that we're talking about today, and it's been on my forefront for over 15 years, is AI, as I have been talking about it. AI, the word itself is not a new word. It's been around for about 50 years, artificial intelligence, but how we use it today. And I think, Patrick, that there's a lot of things going on in the world of AI. Give us a bit of background on what you're seeing in the AI right now, then we'll get into your paper.
Sure. Well, basically, today you could probably see, it kind of burst on the scene maybe 3 years ago with, OpenAI, ChatGPT, but it's been around for much longer than that. If you follow, the Nobel Prizes, you will see that Dr. Jeffrey Hinton, basically one of the godfathers of AI, basically he's been talking about this, like you said, for nearly half a century. And in terms of the markets, this is really important because we know that people in the market are always looking for an edge, and AI is definitely one of those things that I think might be able to give them that edge.
Yeah, and it's what's interesting, Patrick, is that AI in general, as we know it today, for a lot of people, as the internet came around, and you and I were there when it came around, that the beginning of it wasn't what we see today, right? And so there's going to be systemic changes within AI, but right now we're using ChatGPT, Anthropic, Llama. A lot of people, in fact, I believe it's passing up Google searches now on the internet. And how people use AI today is a little different, even the beginning of maybe even a year ago, right? No more questions. Now it's producing pictures and video. But let's get right into your paper. Generative AI and political competition is called neither a panacea nor a Pandora's box. So let's talk to me a little bit about your paper here.
So, well, basically, the reason why I named it that is that I see a lot of hype on both sides. You either say that AI is going to cure everything, or it's going to be like Terminator style robots. Basically, they're going to come in to kill everybody. So it's neither. It's neither one of those things. Like I do in most things, I try to chart a middle course and say that the most important thing is figuring out what's true from what's hype. Because when you're doing that, especially if you're like in a startup or you're in a more established company, the problem becomes how do you tell what is true from what is hype? And this is part of what this paper discusses.
Great, let's get right into it. The first ones are the 4 V's. You call it change, volume, velocity, variety, and veracity. Can you explain us to that a little bit?
Sure. The thing is that one of the ways you can tell whether something's hype or whether something's real is that I have adopted basically the 4 V's, and it talks particularly about change. You can see things are changing so much in the world today. They're changing so quickly. The volume of change is one example. I mean, all the different sectors that we're talking about, but the point is the amount of change is increasing every day. Then that's the volume of change, whether it's from cryptocurrency crises or what's going on, between the Russians and Ukraine. The second one is basically the velocity of change. In other words, the speed of change is also increasing. You're going to see things like drones that are using AI to target things. That was science fiction 5 years ago. Now it's actually happening. Then you're also going to see the variety of change, the different amount of sectors that are changing, whether it's ChatGPT or quantum computing. The amount of sectors of the economy that are being disrupted by these emerging technologies is also increasing. And then finally, veracity. How do you know whether something, like I said, is true or not? In order to do that, it all starts with the data. And you have to remember that if your data is biased or if your data is somehow injected with what they call poison, whether it's through disinformation or misinformation, that becomes a threat, not only to you and your business, but it could become a threat to a larger society. And that's one of the ways that I'm trying to alert people to both, shall we say, the potential, but also the pitfalls of AI.
Yeah, and you're totally right. We talk about the velocity and the veracity and the volume. It just seems like we're getting thrown so much of this AI into our face. And I said this 3 years ago. Look, if you're not learning AI, you're pretty much going to lose your job. And it may be a little more general than that. But it seems that that's already started, right, Patrick? I mean, you're seeing people already losing jobs that are not in the AI business, HR and that kind of thing. Is the velocity and the volume of this, is it moving at a faster pace than you expected, or is it right about what you thought?
Well, this is the thing that's really interesting about this field is the fact that you would expect some type, most of the times, of a linear growth curve, but it's not like that anymore. It's starting to become exponential, where you're starting to see things happening in areas that you didn't expect to see them. For example, we'll talk a little bit later about how we're going to analyze this, but one of the areas is in terms of the asymmetric advantage that businesses have that were early adopters of AI as opposed to people that are just getting into it now. They're having to play catch up. And this is an important problem because when you don't really know how to implement it, then you're tempted to just go to the biggest, shiniest thing. And that may mean not may be the best thing for your business.
Yeah, I mean, with Quasar Markets, we talked about this 2.5 years ago that I wanted to implement this, and it seems like in the fintech world that people are catching up. But when you play catch up, is it allowing you to get to where the new players are, where the old players are, or are they catching up at the same level now that everybody else is at?
Well, basically, if you feel like you're behind the curve, then what ends up happening is that you're willing to take more risk. And as you know, there's no innovation without risk, but you need to measure that risk, whether it's the upside risk or the downside risk. And not all AI is the same. And that's the thing that I try to really explain to people that AI, like anything else, is a tool. And you have to
Right.
understand what are the capabilities of that tool. When I always would joke with my students and they would say, well, we're going to use AI to fix this. And then I might say, yeah, that's like saying I'm going to use a hammer to build a house. That's great,
Right.
but you need to tell me exactly how you're going to build a house. So I'm going to use some nails. Well, that's great, but the problem is that you don't. If you don't tell, for example, the model what you're exactly you're looking for, then you're gonna. That's when you're going to end up getting these weird kind of like strange answers. I would call them
Yeah, and the
because
hallucination of AI seems to be very high, and you're saying that these companies that they're trying to play catch up, the hallucination will be even higher. Is that what you're saying?
well, it can be because if you another joke that I get when I tell my students and I say to them, essentially, if you're telling me please write my essay on X, then yeah, it's going to give you a whole bunch of stuff that's really general, that really isn't specific to you, may not even answer the question. Oh, and yeah, and maybe I'll be nice to you and give you a C. But guess what? That's not what you want. And obviously, if you've got your investors' money at stake, you don't want a C, you want an A. And because of that, that means that you have to really understand things like prompt engineering. You have to understand how to use AI to augment basically the capabilities you already have. And it leads to, I have a lot of A's, shall we say, that I use here, but one of the most important ones is what I call platform agnosticism. But basically, it's a big term, and it basically means this, that look at what your company needs and then find the platform that best fits your needs. So if somebody comes to you and says, I got everything that you need and you only need my platform and you don't need anything else, that's when you need to start looking for the Brooklyn Bridge and saying, okay, what exactly are you trying to sell me? Because in reality, you need something that's going to fit your business. And that's why you will see that many companies now are starting to tailor their models. And if you look at the most recent research that looks about tells you about that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you mentioned too in your paper is that you're talking about the alignment of an AI adoption, attribution, asymmetry, and autonomy of creating guidelines. Is that correct?
That's right. So the thing is, it's I would say, at least from because I'm a public policy scholar, the most important thing that I see now is that we have a whole lot of companies out there, and we need to help them basically with guidelines to see where the shall we say where the boundaries are. And one of the things that can help us do that is what I call it the 4 A's basically. The first one has to do with attribution. And that means that you need to understand where the data is coming from. And that's another big word. It's called data provenance. In other words, you have to understand not only where your data is coming from, what is the quality of that data. I'm sure you've heard a long time ago the I'm giving you a lot of acronyms here, but garbage in, garbage out. You need to
Right.
make sure that you understand not only where your data is coming from, but make sure that you clean it, you do all the technical things that you need to do in order to make sure that it runs well. But in addition to that, you also have this concept of fair use. Last thing you want to do is run into some type of like legal issue by using data that you don't legally have access to. So that's
Yeah, and
attribution.
you're also seeing some of those lawsuits now happening, right, with BBC and Perplexity. So talk to us. Is this going to be a big issue in the future, or is it going to be one that we just kind of stomp out now and we move on?
Well, the thing is that, like anything else, right now you're seeing kind of like the growing pains. If you look at the Stanford Internet Observatory, they came out with a study last year that said that essentially the technology is in its juvenile stage of development. In other words, it's like a teenager. And we all know what teenagers are like. They're always testing the boundaries of whatever's going on. And if there are no, shall we say, there are no adults in the room that are trying to give them those boundaries,
Patrick,
then
I'm still testing the boundaries of where I can
yes.
be, right?
Okay.
Okay, so with that being said, testing the boundaries, what are the boundaries? I mean, I think with Quasar Markets, I have ethical meetings, making sure that my system is not outrageous and not telling lies. I keep it tight, and we have ethical meetings. I know several companies in the fintech space are not ethical in their situation, and where does that start? Where does it stop? Is there going to be like a new Department of Homeland Security for AI? Will we create? And for those of you who don't know, Patrick has been in the U.S. government at the highest levels, Department of Treasury, and writing papers and understanding positions. So, talk to us a little bit about how will the government try to curb some of these irregularities?
So, what I would say the first thing we need to do is we need to understand that there's this concept that's growing in the law, if you will. It's called unjust enrichment. And if you look at a recent competition they had for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and they announced the winner of this paper, and they talk about how do you prevent unjust enrichment. In other words, one of the things that you want to guide yourself, one of the guidelines is, do you have access to this data? And if you do have access, how did you get that access? And what you want to do in the short term is try to prevent, shall we say, legal issues in the long term. Because if you're fighting lawyers all the time, then, at least in my view, then you're not basically doing what's best for you or best for your shareholders, if that makes any sense. So, and I think
Yeah, it does. Go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, when you look at the data, when they're asked where that data came from, do you need to have some paperwork behind it asking, or do you need to be backed up legally? What do you need to do for a company that is actually taking that kind of data?
So what I would say is that obviously the best, the easiest thing to do is to actually have, permission, whether you go site or whatever, if you actually buy the data yourself. That's probably the easiest thing to do, and then you know what you're allowed to do with it. I mean, if you're setting up, obviously most LLMs have some type of API, and
Right.
if you know that your API is just kind of like going on the web and scraping everything, that becomes a little bit more, shall we say, a little bit more risky. So the question is, if you set these things up in the beginning, then it helps you later on down the road. And that's one guideline. The second guideline is agency, I would say, and that means human agency. In other words, you need to make sure that your customers understand, what their rights are. And we all know that everybody has an EULA. Almost none of your customers read it.
That's right.
So,
yes, of course.
So what you want to do is make sure you set those things up in your EULA, and then make sure that people understand what their rights are and you understand what you're doing. Basically, it's almost like that concept of informed consent. And I think that will go a longer way to having people really understand what they can do and what, not just the company, but also the people, because you want to encourage a relationship. And when I used to work in the UAE, worked there for many years, they're interested in relationships, not just for one time, but for a long time. And I think if you're setting up that kind of relationship with your customers, and they're going to be more loyal to you than if they think that you're just there to make a quick buck off of them.
And what do you mean by asymmetry and autonomy? Are you saying that the world of AI is not equal?
So, well, I'm saying yes. Well, there's asymmetry. There are two types of asymmetry. Number one, you've got the big players, whether it's in the United States or China or Europe, or even the big players, in terms of corporations. They have a different, you might say, level of ability, but also a different level of access than smaller players. Than in the not everybody has access to the same models, if you will. Those frontier models have a different, shall we say, level. But the point is that even smaller players can use AI, like I said, in some ways in a political sense. You can use it, or a military sense, as a force multiplier. So if you're a small or medium-sized enterprise, or a small or medium-sized country, you might say, you can use AI basically to help you in terms of preparing for what's the challenges that are out there that meet you. And you can see this happening right now between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine is about the 10th the size of Russia, and yet they've used, I would say, not just drone technology, but combined that with I would say now increasingly sophisticated forms of AI targeting to pull off some pretty spectacular strategic surprises. The last one a couple of weeks ago, you see where they used literally drones that are worth about $500, commercial, off the shelf, to literally destroy billions of dollars of strategic assets. That is an asymmetric advantage that did not exist 5 years ago, and that is really going to change things geopolitically. I mean, in terms of the geopolitical.
And when we talk about that, I mean, we're not in cahoots with Russia. We're not in cahoots with North Korea. What is stopping them from getting those $500 drones and dropping them off in the United States or in allies with this AI technology? And I almost hearken to say agentic AI too, where it becomes part of who we are, and maybe we become friends with these drones and these humanoids or robots, and then Skynet gets created, and all of a sudden Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sarah Connor comes down. There's a big fight in the middle of California. So what is stopping all of that? It seems that people are very nervous about all of this, Patrick.
So, well, that's the issue, and that's why it leads to that fourth A, and that's the level of autonomy. If you read the work of Paul Scher, he's a pretty good, strategic thinker. He talks about three types, you might say, three steps along the road to a fully autonomous system. The first one is where a human is in the loop. In other words, before the AI, before the system can make any decision, especially any life or death decision, it not only has to consult a human being, the human being is the one that has to push the button. That's the traditional thing we're dealing with right now. You've got drones, there's somebody attached to that drone, an Air Force officer, somebody else, and then they actually have to make the decision, and then they're the ones that actually push the button. Then you have then the next stage of autonomy is where instead of in the loop, you're on the loop, which means you've got a loitering munition that's waiting around there somewhere. And then when it finds something, then it contacts you and says, hey, we think we found Osama bin Laden. And then it decides, what do you want to do? And then the human being still is the one that has to make the decision. But they're not actually there watching the screen 24 hours a day. That's on the loop. Finally, there's off the loop, and that's getting much closer to a fully autonomous system that you just set it out there and you say, find Osama bin Laden. Then when it finds him, it says, okay, these are my mission parameters. I've figured out what to do. This is my target, and everything is within my rules of engagement. I'm going to fire the missile. So the question is, how far along that stream do we want to be in terms of AI, and in particular agentic AI? Are we going to allow it to do whatever it wants, or are we going to have some type of say, shall we say, in the decision making? That's how you prevent the whole Terminator thing from happening, is that that you're essentially you have some type of control. Now the thing is,
let me ask you this. I mean, I think people are asking the question now: are humanoids or robots, or is quantum computing? Is it awake now? Is it sentient now? Is it doing its own thing, living its own life, not needing a human interaction, not needing some intermediary or even agentic AI, are they awake now?
No, see, that's a very good question because over the last couple of years, you can see that there are different people that have been saying that they believe that we're approaching something called AGI or artificial general intelligence. I would say that we're some time away from that. I mean, exactly how far, to be honest with you, depends on the researchers that you talk to. But fundamentally, I think one of the issues that we have here is that we don't really, many people don't really understand what artificial intelligence is. I mean, for the most part, right now in particular, even the frontier models are based on something called a transformer architecture. And I can explain to you what that is, but essentially it means this, that there are a whole bunch of parameters that are based on weights and probabilities that make it mimic what looks like, shall we say, human intelligence. But in reality, it does not think, it does not reason, at least not in the way that human beings do. And that the person that's programming it in many ways is the one responsible for how it looks. And now there are obviously many, many people that are involved in these models. But right now, there is no model that I'm aware of that is actually sentient. In other words, there's some of them that can pass what they call the Turing test, but that test was invented literally it was invented in World War II, essentially, right after, around, I would say maybe the 50s. I have to check myself on that. But the point is that what we thought was possible 70 years ago is nowhere near what we think is possible today. And that's why.
If you look at the Dick Tracy watches of the 60s of my parents' ages, right? What we have today. But the question I have to ask is that now technology is passing even some people's even thoughts of what technology should be in the future, and it seems to be set by the people that we don't necessarily care about. The Elon Musks, the Mark Zuckerbergs, the Satya Nadellas, are they the ones going to set our future based on what they're thinking, or is it going to be based? I mean, I saw where Oxford, the library itself, is opening up all of their books to AI. We're seeing libraries opening up their books and saying, please devour all of the data in here. What is it that you are seeing that needs to separate this? Because I really don't want to live a life like Mark Zuckerberg. I really don't want to live my life thinking Elon Musk's thinking. How do we separate that, Patrick?
Well, I think that this is one of the reasons why I've been involved with the United Nations with something called the Policy Network on Artificial Intelligence. That essentially they're also developing guidelines, but in particular, what's very important is collaboration and what they call multi-stakeholder engagement. In other words, everybody in the pool, essentially, to understand why things are developing the way that they are, and like I said, to set some guidelines. But even more importantly, that everybody is accountable. And accountability, I think, is key in this particular endeavor, you might call it. And in particular, what I'm talking about is how do you set these lines of accountability and understand that everybody that's involved in the AI life cycle, everybody has some form of responsibility and, most importantly, transparency. What are the models doing? And the thing is, this whole black box that everybody seems to be operating from now and accepting, I think, is one of the things that we need to stop accepting. Stop accepting the black box that basically tells them, you're just going to have to trust me on this. There's this thing in cybersecurity called a zero trust model. I think that's something that needs to be implemented. And if you look at the different multinational efforts, if you look at there was a big meeting on AI in Paris, in February of this year, where they started talking about some of this stuff. And understanding that this zero trust model essentially means that you take nothing for granted. I mean, it's much more complicated than that, but when you're trying to implement it, you're trying to understand that what you are doing right now impacts what everybody else is doing. We're all connected.
The butterfly effect kind of thing, right? Yes. Right.
And that's the thing. And the amount of risk that you take impacts the amount of risk that basically combines, you might say, if you want to get.
But how do we put the guardrails on the Elon Musks and the Mark Zuckerbergs? How do we say, no, Jeff Bezos, you can't create AI that runs my world? How do we do that with that? Because they are the technology gurus that are setting the standards for us on just about everything. I mean, I saw my Alexa Plus just got upgraded, and I'm probably going to talk to me here in a few minutes about life, and it's much easier, and agentic AI is kicking in. But how do we stop that?
Well, I think part of the thing is that realizing that, like I said, first of all, where are we right now? Understanding where we are. Are we in the loop? Are we on the loop? Or are we off the loop? And what things are essentially, you might say out of bounds. And at least in the West, for example, we actually have the power of the purse, if you will, not just the Congress, but I mean the people themselves, in understanding what they actually want. I mean, I remember 25 years ago when they said that essentially the internet should not be regulated at all. And I understood what they were talking about back then, but I think it's long since time that we actually have some type of these guidelines. And part of that is going through governments, but also it's going through, larger organizations, whether it's the UN or the EU. I mean, there's some organizations, some groups that have already passed things. If we look at the EU AI Act, that's one thing. That's one road you can go to. But also, it's developing this public-private, shall we say, partnership, and understanding that it's important that everybody have a seat at the table. If this makes any sense to you, when we're discussing what's happening here, but in particular, what are things that are allowed and not allowed? In other words, and obviously the law has something to do with that. I mean, that's why this concept of unjust enrichment may be more, I think it's a better way to look at things than just liability, because once you give things to the lawyers, as you know, it's going to take a while. So the thing is, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the lawyer side of things, it's easier to just copy and paste. But what's not easier to copy and paste on the lawyer side is the Gen AI side. And you've got geopolitical side of Gen AI where it just makes up pictures and it say whatever it pretty much wants to say, right? I mean, you've got security, scale, and sustainability. Talk to us a little bit about that too.
Sure. So, well, basically, when I'm talking about security is, first of all, and like I said, it begins with data means data security, which means that each company, but also each, governments have to understand what it means. As data centers proliferate, you're going to have increased, basically, if you're a cybersecurity guy, you'll know what this is, an increased attack surface. In other words, and you have to understand that these data centers are essentially the heart of the AI. And you need to make sure that they're secure both physically, but also online, so that you don't have, people get, not people getting into your system, but you understand that, again, the data that's coming in there, you have to understand, not only should the data not be biased, but you have to understand who has access to that data. So that's part of what security is. Then you also have to understand that in terms of scaling, there is a law that you probably heard about it. It's called Moore's Law, that basically says that the speed, basically the computer chip is increasing every 18 months. We're coming, shall we say, to the physical limit of that. Quantum computing may open up a whole new vista when it comes to that particular type of computing power. But this also leads to this next issue, because most of the models are now reaching their limits. We're not going to tell you this because obviously they want to get more investment. But the point is they're having more and more hallucinations. Why? Because they ingest so much data, but they're getting original data for them is starting to become harder and harder. So as they scale up, there's always been this idea that scale will solve every problem. But they found in the research is that scale will not solve every problem. And as you get larger and larger, you need to make sure that you have, like I said, those guidelines that we're talking about.
But if you have larger data sets and you have larger numbers of people that are in system that's asking questions, will that not help the system?
It depends, honestly, on essentially, the way the system works is that you ask it a question, and then if it doesn't get the answer, you don't get the answer you're expecting, then basically you're saying that's not what I expected, and it helps to improve it. But the problem becomes that over time, I guess I'm trying to get not too technical here, but over time.
No, get technical. Get technical as can be, Patrick. It's okay.
Okay, sure. That's fine. Well, the thing is, there's this thing called model collapse that essentially means that the AI itself starts basically hallucinating more and more because essentially it's not um, getting the data that it needs. And that's why you see a lot more of these issues that they start kind of like that's why you see different universities, they want them to open their books so we can get more access to this original data. And model collapse is a serious issue when it comes to the quality of the answers that you're getting.
Have we seen model collapse in any GPTs yet?
Well, the thing is, the ones that they release, shall we say, publicly, I would say that there's sometimes you'll see pretty bad hallucinations, but I'm not sure we've seen a model collapse yet. But internally, anybody that's working at any of these companies will acknowledge that that's a problem because as the parameters get larger, you go from billions to even trillions of parameters. The problem becomes that this again, it's the black box issue. They don't really know, and if they really tell you, and some of them have admitted this, they really don't know how it's making the decisions that it's making. And when that starts to happen, this is one of the big problems, if you will.
And for me, not only is security and scale an issue, but I think security also is the energy side of it too, right? The sustainability of all of AI. And I think you of all people are very tight when it comes to sustainability issues. So can you explain to us, are we burning up the planet faster than ever now because of AI?
Well, this is the issue, that there are both sustainable and unsustainable ways to run a model. And right now, a lot of the models are being run in, I would say, unsustainable ways. There's a couple of papers out there that you want to look at them. You will see that the amount of energy that it takes to run one of these frontier models is equivalent to that to, let's say, a small town. I mean, it's a huge amount of energy. And the thing is, if we continue on the same path that we're on right now, in the next, I would say, 20 years, it's possible that a majority of all of the energy that's being produced on the planet will be devoted to these AI models. And that's obviously not something that's sustainable. And there's something that we can do about that. I mean, there are different types of models that we can use, but the ones that we're using right now, you might say they're energy hogs, for sure. Right now,
okay. So in the future, we keep hearing quantum computing, of which I'm part of. Talk to me a little bit. Is that going to solve the problems with the speed? Are we going to have nuclear power plants in everybody's backyard with power? How are we going to? I mean, we always seem to be able to fix the problem in front of us, right? But will the problem be fixed?
Well, the thing is, as we get more and more sophisticated systems, for example, I was just talking to a professor this week about secure forms of communication, but also using different forms, basically, of materials that are not as energy intensive. One of the most important things that I think is going to happen is in the next 5 to 10 years, when quantum becomes more commercially available. It depends on the type of quantum computer you're talking about. But if you're using one, for example, that's photonic, in other words, it uses pulses of light, basically, and they're created on this chip, they can operate a lot closer to room temperature than a lot of the systems we have now. One of the biggest energy consumption issues that we have here in terms of AI and also in terms of quantum is not just the amount of energy that it produces, but the amount of heat it gives off. Right. And you need something to be able to cool that off. And what do we use most of the time now? Well, water or refrigeration. Now you have huge amounts of water that are being used. That's unsustainable. But in terms of these systems that have to operate close to absolute zero, the amount of hardware that you need to cool something down to almost absolute zero is also a huge amount of energy. So if you can find a system that can operate closer basically to room temperature, then that will definitely help in terms of the energy use. But also in terms of if you don't have that massive amount of heat being produced, that will also help you basically in terms of the, shall we say, sustainability of this product. I mean, there are lots of different types of quantum, shall we say, chips that are being created, but ones that can use, that can operate closer to this room temperature will help. And I would say also, the thing is that we also need something that could work with existing technology. For example, fiber optic cables, because in addition to to using just one quantum computer, the latest research I would say is that um, developing. Well, I mean, I don't know how much your audience knows about quantum computers, but they know that one of the principles that they use, is called superposition, and another one is entanglement. When you use these two together, it's what gives you, shall we say, that quantum advantage. And what's happening right now is they're trying to develop systems, basically, of quantum computers to create eventually a quantum internet. But in order to do that, it's very, very highly technical. But in order to do that, you need to be able to have good connections. And they have to be very secure connections because of the nature, basically, of how a quantum computer works. So I think that definitely other issues and things like quantum are definitely one part of the answer. Another part of the answer is also using other types of computing that perhaps now are more, you might say, on the frontier, but also are going to help us.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a type of computing called neuromorphic computing. It basically mimics what the brain does and how the brain works.
And when I hear all of this stuff, Patrick,
Yes.
as a finance person, the thing keeps hitting my mind is costs are going to go to the roof. Is this viable financially in the future, or are we going to just have to wait until Moore's law catches up?
Well, see, this is the thing that's really interesting is that you're seeing a lot of different, basically, developments along different, basically, avenues at the same time or in parallel. And I agree with you that cost is an issue, but it's like anything else. Those that invest in the beginning, shall we say, you might say there are two different strategies. You probably, if anybody's been to business school, they know that there's a blue ocean strategy and a red ocean strategy. So right now, I think we're definitely in the blue ocean when it comes to a number of these, initiatives. And as they
can you explain blue ocean strategy? Can you explain the blue ocean strategy for those maybe don't understand that?
Sure. So basically, with the blue ocean strategy means there are not many players in the market. And right. There are more people that get into that market. They have more, shall we say, of a free range. But it's also the barrier to entry. In other words, the cost is much higher. And and what happens is that as you get more and more players into the market, it starts to become, shall we say, a red ocean, and that's when the cost is going to start to come down. What's happening is the same thing that happened with solar power. Initially, definitely a blue ocean market. But now it's been running for another, I would say, maybe 25 years, you can see it's definitely become more of a red ocean market. And in particular, you have to look at the companies and in particular the countries that have really invested a lot in that. And this is where this aspect of geopolitical competition comes in again, because you've got the United States, you've got China, you've got Europe. Who is the leader in drone production right now? China. Mm-hmm. Who is the lead in terms of the production of strategic minerals that we're going to need basically for a lot of these fancy technologies? China. And who is the leader right now in terms of producing more solar power than anybody else in terms of China? You can see a point. You can see a pattern evolving here that China is no longer, I would say, it's something we need to not only consider, but I would call them a near peer competitor now. So when it comes to a lot of these technologies, and because of that, it means that the United States, at least in my view, needs to invest a lot more than we're investing in right now in order for us to be able to help direct where this.
And when you say investing, are you saying it from the government side, or are you saying it from the private industries?
I think both of them do. I think we both need to basically invest, and this is, I guess when people ask me about the kind of strategy that they should pursue, I say that we need to reframe our strategy. And the way we need to reframe it is right now, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of James Carse, and also it was popularized by Simon Sinek. He said, what type of game are you playing? Are you playing a finite game or an infinite game? Now, a finite game is where you know who the players are, the rules pretty much stay the same, and you know what the objective is. For example, in baseball, the objective is to win the game. Whereas if you're playing an infinite game, it means that the players can change, the rules often can change, but more importantly, the objective is to survive. In other words, to keep playing. And the
Hmm.
reason why I use this analogy is that there's a whole bunch of research that shows that when a finite player meets an infinite player, the infinite player always wins because they've got not only a longer term, outlook, but more importantly, they make investments that basically understand that the ultimate, you might say, the ultimate goal here is to survive.
And
And
I would say that the infinite goal player here is China, correct?
yes, this is the issue that I've been explaining to people is that we don't need to change everything everything we're doing. Excuse me. What we need to do is to reframe how we're looking at it and understand that we're the game that we're playing, and whether it's generative AI or
But isn't the game moving faster than what we can actually sit down and describe? Yes.
well, no. This is part of the issue. Is that that's why we need technologies like artificial intelligence to help us augment our decision making capacity. If you look at quantum, one of the things that I've been working on lately, or actually for a couple of years now, is understanding how you can apply quantum to strategy, and in particular, how it allows you to analyze and to evaluate more scenarios at the same time. And this is why it's so important is that we need, because things are moving so quickly right now, because things are changing so much so quickly, we need something that can help us basically to analyze things more quickly. And I think that using AI and using quantum, and we can talk another time about how it's actually going to start, they're starting to combine them, if you will. There is definitely a market, not necessarily a market, I would say, but definitely there are people starting to look at combining quantum and AI. For example, in finance, there's a lot more being involved right now, especially I would say in the fintech space, where you're trying to combine quantum with AI to get, for example, quantum machine learning algorithms that are able to better predict markets. So,
With that, Patrick, I'm gonna let it go because I want to have you back on here in a week or two and discussing the next level of Gen AI and predictive AI. Right?
okay. Well, that would be great. Thank you very much. It was
Yes.
a pleasure talking to you.
Absolutely. Dr. Patrick Bell, a friend of mine for over 29, 30 years now, I think, Patrick. My goodness. Thank you for being on the show, and we'll see you right back here in a couple of weeks.
Okay, sounds great.